The first frost of November painted the city in dull shades of gray. Each morning, fog hung low between the aging apartment blocks, and the streets echoed with the sound of boilers kicking in, except for one building on Ashbury Avenue. Inside apartment 2B, the radiators were silent. The windows were fogged from breath, not heat, and the air inside felt like a sealed refrigerator. The tenant, a young data analyst named Elias Mercer, sat at his kitchen table wearing gloves. His laptop screen glowed in the dim light, graphs and spreadsheets flickering with color. A cup of coffee, long gone cold, sat beside him. Each time he exhaled, a faint cloud of vapor rose. He had filed 3 maintenance requests already. Each time the landlord's office replied with vague promises or total silence. The building was old, red brick, 4 floors, built sometime in the early 70s. The kind of place that once had charm before greed hollowed it out. Elias had chosen it for its proximity to downtown, its affordable rent, and the quiet neighbors. But the quiet had turned into something else. A sort of resignation lingered in the hallways, the kind that came from tenants too tired to fight. The plaster was cracked, the elevators groaned, and every radiator hissed like an exhausted sigh. At first, Elias thought it was a simple repair delay. But when the second week of cold came, he started documenting. Every day, he took a time-stamped video of his thermostat. He noted the interior temperature, never above 55 degrees Fahrenheit. He kept screenshots of every ignored email, every unreturned call. And then, one morning, when he saw the landlord's SUV parked outside, he went down to speak face to face. The man's name was Harold Nix, late 50s, thick-necked, the kind of man who always carried the scent of cigar smoke and cheap cologne. He owned several buildings in the area, most of them run down. His business motto was simple: neglect, threaten, collect rent. And if tenants complained, he made life unbearable until they left. When Elias confronted him, Harold smirked. He said the heat worked fine in other units and suggested Elias check his windows. It wasn't just dismissive, it was deliberate. That's when Elias realized it wasn't a malfunction, it was punishment. Harold had noticed his previous maintenance complaints about mold, about unsafe wiring, and now he was retaliating. That night, Elias slept wearing 2 jackets. He could hear the distant hum of heaters from neighboring buildings, but not his own. The old pipes in the walls clicked occasionally, mocking him. He opened his laptop again and began researching, not about heating, but about landlord laws, tenant rights, and building codes. His analytical mind, used to dissecting financial data, now turned towards something far colder: legal evidence. He discovered that city law required a minimum indoor temperature during winter months. Failure to provide it was a serious violation. And each violation carried fines per day, per unit. Elias began collecting proof not just for himself but for the entire building. He started talking to neighbors, the single mother on the 3rd floor, the retired teacher downstairs, the couple who always argued over rent. All of them had stories: leaks, rats, mold, and silence from management. Soon, a quiet alliance formed. Elias became the unofficial representative. He compiled everything into organized folders: dates, photos, receipts. His laptop turned into an archive of the landlord's negligence. Then, one evening, he sent it all, not to Harold, but to the city's housing department. Weeks passed, and the temperature dropped even further. Elias still lived in a freezing apartment, but he could feel the pressure shifting. Inspectors began visiting. They photographed the hallways, the broken mailboxes, the peeling ceiling in the laundry room. Harold started showing up more often, nervous now, muttering to the janitor about busybody tenants. Then came the letter. The city issued multiple citations, thousands of dollars in fines. Elias didn't smile when he read it, but something in his chest thawed, just a little. He knew this was only the beginning. Because men like Harold didn't pay. They found ways to squeeze others instead, and sure enough, the eviction notices began. But Elias was ready. The next chapter of this Cold War was just beginning, and it wouldn't be fought in court alone. It would end with ownership. The first eviction notice arrived like a slap of cold wind, taped to Elias's door in the middle of the night. A bright yellow paper, crumpled at the corners, stamped "Pay or Vacate." It accused him of withholding rent, of violating lease terms, of harassing management. Every line was a lie, but it carried an undeniable weight. To most tenants, such notices meant panic. To Elias, it meant Harold was getting desperate. He didn't panic. Instead, he sat back down at his small kitchen table, opened his laptop, and began documenting again. Photo of the notice, timestamp, metadata recorded. He then logged every heating violation still ongoing, every day of cold, every unanswered maintenance ticket. His folder, titled Evidence, was growing by the hour. But this wasn't just about revenge, not anymore. Elias wanted protection. He'd read enough to understand that the law had mechanisms, quiet but powerful, designed for tenants exactly like him. One of them was rent escrow. Under the city's housing code, if a landlord failed to provide essential services like heat, tenants could pay their rent into a court-controlled account rather than directly to the landlord. The money stayed frozen until the violations were fixed. It was a legal trapdoor, one that left landlords cornered. And now Elias had found his weapon. The next day, he visited the city housing office. The clerk at the counter, tired-eyed but kind, looked through his neatly organized evidence and nodded slowly. "You've done everything right," she said. "We'll set up the escrow account." By the end of the week, every tenant Elias had spoken to was paying into escrow instead of Harold's pocket. Rent money, thousands of dollars, was now locked away untouchable, and that's when Harold truly began to unravel. He stormed into the building days later, red-faced, barking threats through the hallways. The tenants stayed behind closed doors, whispering behind peepholes. They had all seen the letters from the city, the mounting penalties, the warnings, the inspection dates. Harold's empire of fear was cracking. Elias watched quietly from his door, recording everything from a small camera clip to his shelf. No words, no confrontation, just silent evidence. Winter deepened. Snow buried the curbs. Still, the radiators in the building stayed dead. Harold was betting on cold misery to break the tenants' resolve. But instead, it forged something stronger. Neighbors began pooling together, bringing space heaters, cooking hot meals in shared kitchens, checking in on each other during the nights. The building, once silent and fragmented, began to feel alive again, united by shared defiance. In January, another letter arrived. The city had escalated enforcement. That single word, auction, hit Elias like lightning. He read the document 3 times. His analytical mind instantly began running numbers. Estimated property value, existing liens, unpaid fines, potential purchase price at auction. His savings were nearly enough, but his mind was already racing through strategies, partnerships, financing, equity leverage. He realized something incredible. The very system Harold abused might now turn against him completely. But Harold wasn't done fighting dirty. 2 weeks before the city's deadline, repair crews appeared. They patched walls, replaced a few pipes, and turned the heat on for a single day. Then they disappeared. The following morning, the temperature plummeted again. It was a performance, not compliance, a desperate show to delay the inevitable. Elias submitted a follow-up report with time-stamped videos proving the deception. It was enough for the housing department to push forward with enforcement. Harold's appeal was denied. His name was blacklisted from new permits. And within a month, the notice appeared in public records. Foreclosure auction scheduled, Ashbury Avenue property. The day Elias read that notice, he didn't smile. He just sat in silence, realizing how far things had come from that first freezing night. He was still a tenant. Still paying into escrow. Still cold. But now, the balance of power has shifted completely. For the first time, the building didn't feel like a prison. It felt like an opportunity. And deep down, Elias knew one thing. He wouldn't let an outsider buy it. He was going to find a way somehow to become the new owner himself. The morning of the auction notice, Elias woke before dawn. The air inside his apartment was still cold, but the atmosphere had changed. The silence wasn't suffocating anymore, it was full of potential. The fog on the window blurred the city skyline, and in that gray haze, he saw possibility. For months, he had been surviving in this frozen, neglected place. Now, he wanted to own it. He poured a cup of black coffee, opened his laptop, and began building a spreadsheet, the kind of tool he used every day at his job, except this one was personal. He titled it, Ashbury Avenue Takeover. The first column listed every apartment in the building. 16 units total. The second column estimated their rents, occupancy rates, and market value. Then came the maintenance costs, property taxes, outstanding fines, and potential net income. Elias's fingers moved with precision, the rhythm of a man who found calm in data. By noon, the spreadsheet told him what his gut already suspected. The building was undervalued, bleeding money only because Harold has starved it for years. Restored and properly managed, it could turn profitable within a year. But none of that mattered without capital. Elias's savings were modest, barely enough for a down payment, nowhere near enough to bid at auction. He had no family wealth, no investors waiting in the wings. But he did have information, and information he knew was leverage. He started researching community property funds, small-scale investment groups, and social housing cooperatives that helped tenants purchase distressed buildings. The city had pilot programs designed for exactly this scenario, partnerships where tenants, through pooled funding and matching grants, could take ownership of mismanaged housing. It was complicated, bureaucratic, and slow, but possible. He also discovered something else. The building wasn't the only one Harold owned. There were 6 others, all under the same LLC. 2 of them were already facing smaller fines. The man was drowning in debt, but still too proud to admit it. That's when Elias realized he had a window of opportunity. If he could show that he and a small group of tenants were ready to stabilize the property, to fix what Harold had destroyed, they could secure both legal priority and financial backing. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting the rules. He called a small meeting in the laundry room that evening. The tenants gathered, wrapped in jackets, holding cups of instant coffee. The machines hummed behind them as Elias explained the plan, the auction, the potential to buy, the funding options. At first, there was silence. Then, slowly, cautious hope began to take root. The retired teacher offered to chip in part of her savings. The couple on the 3rd floor had relatives in construction. The single mother offered her time to manage paperwork. Piece by piece, a coalition was forming. Elias spent the next 2 weeks buried in numbers, forms, and city grant proposals. His workdays blurred into nights, but he didn't mind. Every detail, from the valuation reports to the bidding terms, became part of a strategy that was no longer theoretical. He even began reaching out to local housing lawyers, drafting early outlines of a purchase plan. But Harold wasn't sleeping either. One morning, Elias woke to the sound of banging downstairs. A notice had been stapled to the front door, building to be sold as is before auction. Harold was trying to dump the property privately before the city could seize it. It was a desperate move and a dangerous one. If he succeeded, the fines would transfer to a new owner, but the tenants could lose their chance entirely. Elias immediately sent the notice to the housing department. Within days, the city froze the sale, citing active violation penalties. Harold's maneuver had backfired. The clock ticked on, and the auction date held firm. By late February, the atmosphere in the building was electric. Inspectors came and went. Real estate agents appeared, taking photos for the listing. The tenants whispered about investors circling, some corporate buyers, some silent developers looking for a cheap flip. Elias watched them all closely. He knew their kind. Clean suits, fast talk, and no intention of repairing anything. They would evict everyone within weeks. He couldn't let that happen. In a dim apartment lit only by his laptop's glow, Elias crafted a proposal, a clean, professional presentation that outlined a tenant-led purchase under a new management partnership. He projected potential income, community value, and maintenance savings. He wasn't just trying to buy a building, he was selling a vision. He sent it to the city's housing committee, and to one specific contact he'd made, a regional nonprofit director named Marjorie Lane, who specialized in tenant ownership transitions. 2 days later, she responded. Her organization had funds for distressed housing acquisitions, limited, but flexible. She wanted to meet. When Elias met Marjorie at a small cafe downtown, she listened quietly as he explained everything. The retaliation, the evidence, the escrow. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she leaned back, folded her hands and said, "If what you're saying is true, we might be able to help. But you'll need to move fast." Fast became an understatement. The following week turned into a storm of paperwork, notarized documents, and negotiation calls. Marjorie's nonprofit agreed to partner as a co-bidder, using tenant investment as leverage for matching grants. It wasn't certain, but it was real. Harold must have sensed something. For the first time in months, the heat came on and stayed on. Notices appeared promising full renovations, and rent payments were suddenly forgiven for a month. It was too late. The city had already locked the auction date. On the night before the auction, Elias barely slept. The snow outside fell in slow motion, and the old building creaked like it was breathing. He thought about everything that had happened, the freezing nights, the silence, the threats, and how all of it had led to this single point. Tomorrow, the building would have a new owner. Either Harold's empire would survive one more day, or it would fall into the hands of the very tenant he'd tried to freeze out. The morning of the auction arrived with a pale, merciless light. Snow had turned to slush overnight, coating the streets in gray water that mirrored the dull sky above. Elias walked quickly, coat buttoned high, papers tucked inside a folder under his arm. His breath hung in front of him like fog as he crossed the square toward the county courthouse, an imposing structure of stone and glass that seemed designed to intimidate. Inside, the echo of footsteps filled the marble corridor. The foreclosure auction was being held in a chamber on the second floor, a room lined with long wooden benches and the faint smell of coffee. A row of bidders sat waiting, each with the same quiet calculation in their eyes. Men in tailored suits, women with clipboards, a few agents whispering to each other. The usual crowd that fed on distress and opportunity. At the front stood the auctioneer, setting up his papers beside a microphone. Behind him, a clerk checked the list of properties, single-family homes, small commercial lots, and then near the bottom, Ashbury Avenue, multi-unit residential, 4 floors, 16 units, Elias's building. Elias sat near the back beside Marjorie, who had arrived minutes earlier, calm but alert. She carried a leather folder filled with contracts, funding letters, and pre-approval documents. Her organization was officially registered as the bidding entity, but Elias's name was on every line beneath it. Together, they represented the tenants and the possibility of something different. When the auction began, the first few listings moved quickly. Numbers flew across the room, monotone voices calling out bids like clockwork. Elias tried to steady his breathing. Each time a gavel struck, the sound reverberated through his chest. Then, at last, the clerk read the next address. Item number 12-214 Ashbury Avenue. Multi-unit residential building, 16 occupied units, outstanding municipal fines totaling $43,000. Opening bid starts at $250,000. The room shifted slightly, papers rustled. One of the investors, a tall man with slicked back hair, raised his hand. $250. Another followed. $260. The numbers began to climb. $270, $280, $295. Each increase sounded casual. Like they were bidding on furniture, not homes filled with lives. Marjorie remained still, eyes focused on her notes. Elias watched the figures tick upward. His spreadsheet had predicted the building's fair market value at around $350, maybe less given its condition. But emotion was dangerous currency here. He forced himself to remember, numbers first, not pride. When the bids slowed at $300,000, Marjorie finally spoke. $310, she said clearly. Heads turned. The auctioneer acknowledged her with a curt nod. The tall investor smirked. $320, Marjorie countered. $325. Another bidder joined, a corporate representative from a real estate firm Elias recognized from his research. They specialized in renovate and flip properties, notorious for mass evictions. He called out $340. Marjorie leaned toward Elias. We can go to $370 if needed, she whispered. After that, we'll need additional justification. Elias's pulse quickened. $350, Marjorie called. The corporate bidder responded instantly. $360. There was a pause, a thick silence as the auctioneer scanned the room. Then Marjorie spoke again, her tone steady. $370. The bidder frowned, conferring with a colleague. They hesitated. Elias could almost hear the gears turning, the calculations of profit margins, renovation costs, eviction fees. The building wasn't worth the headache unless the price stayed low. The man leaned back, expression sour. The auctioneer called out once, twice. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell. Sold. $370,000 to Lane Housing Cooperative. Elias exhaled slowly, as if releasing months of tension in a single breath. Around him, the other bidders shuffled papers, indifferent. For them, it was another lost deal. For him, it was deliverance. Marjorie placed a hand on his arm. Congratulations, she said softly. You're about to own your first building. The words didn't feel real yet. Ownership. It wasn't a dream Elias had ever entertained. He'd grown up believing ownership belonged to others, to landlords, corporations, people born into leverage. But now, in a twist of bureaucracy and persistence, he had crossed a line most tenants never reached. As they finalized signatures and payment arrangements, Harold appeared. He stormed into the chamber like a storm front, coat half-buttoned, eyes red with fury. His lawyer followed behind him, trying to keep pace. He scanned the room, and when his gaze landed on Elias, something dark and dangerous flickered there. You, he hissed under his breath as he passed by, but his voice didn't carry far enough to draw attention. Elias didn't respond. He just watched quietly as Harold argued with the clerk, his words sharp and desperate. But the clerk shook his head. The property was sold, the paperwork signed, the funds verified. There was no room left for rage. Outside, the cold air bit at Elias's face, but this time it didn't matter. The heat inside his chest was enough. Marjorie was smiling faintly as they walked toward the curb. You'll need to meet with the city next week, she said. Transfer of ownership, inspection scheduling, all that. But it's yours now. Or soon will be. Elias nodded. The streetlights flickered on as dusk settled. He looked back toward the courthouse steps, toward Harold still standing there, motionless, his empire reduced to paperwork and dust. It wasn't victory Elias felt. It was something quieter, deeper. Justice, maybe. That night, when he returned to 214 Ashbury Avenue, the tenants gathered in the hall. News had spread faster than he expected. There were cheers, tears, and laughter. The same people who once feared eviction now stood together under a roof that finally belonged to them. But Elias knew this was just the beginning. The real work was ahead. Inspections, repairs, debts to settle, systems to rebuild. Ownership meant responsibility. It meant transforming this place from a battleground into a home. He walked the hallway once more, running his hand along the cracked wall. For the first time, it didn't feel like decay. It felt like potential. Winter dragged on like a test of endurance. Outside, the city slept under a crust of ice. Inside, 214 Ashbury Avenue breathed with cautious warmth. But within the walls of apartment 2B, something else burned, not just determination, but a cold, strategic fire. Elias had shifted fully from survival to offense. He no longer thought like a tenant or a building manager. He thought like an investigator, someone tracing corruption through numbers, metadata, and paper trails. Every night, while the rest of the building slept, Elias sat at his kitchen table, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating files, folders, and patterns. His fingers moved with surgical precision across the keyboard. He was dissecting Harold Nix's empire, one LLC, one shell company, one dirty transaction at a time. It started small. Using public records, Elias pulled property tax statements, ownership deeds, and corporate filings. At first glance, they looked legitimate: Nix Holdings LLC, Ashbury Management Corp., HN Realty Group. But beneath those names were dozens of subsidiaries with overlapping addresses and recycled officer signatures. A tangled web meant to confuse auditors and protect assets. Then came the irregularities. He noticed the same repair contractor, Maverick Maintenance Co., built multiple buildings owned by Harold for identical work on identical dates. It was impossible. The pattern repeated across different neighborhoods. Someone was fabricating invoices, siphoning money, and reporting those expenses as losses for tax relief. Elias began cross-referencing with court records. He found eviction filings, dozens of them, each under different company names, but all bearing the same lawyer's signature. The same property photos, the same generic affidavits. It wasn't management, it was an operation. A machine that profited from neglect, then buried accountability under paper camouflage. He created a flowchart that mapped Harold's entire financial structure like a digital skeleton of greed. Every name, every date, every alias. The pattern was undeniable. He had built a network of front companies to drain money from decaying buildings, then let fines accumulate until foreclosure. When one property fell, another shell company would absorb the loss, leaving the victims behind. The revelation hit Elias like thunder. Harold didn't care about reclaiming 214 Ashbury Avenue. He needed to silence it. If the cooperative survived, if the city recognized its success, others might start digging. Tenants elsewhere might fight back. So Elias decided to do what Harold never expected. He prepared a full data dossier, hundreds of pages of linked evidence, timelines, and transaction summaries. He called it Project Furnace, a nod to the heat Harold had once weaponized against them. His plan wasn't to submit it quietly through bureaucracy. He wanted sunlight, public exposure. He reached out to a local investigative journalist he followed for years, a man known for unmasking predatory landlords and corporate fraud. The reply came faster than Elias expected. Meet tomorrow morning. Bring everything. The meeting took place in a cafe downtown. The journalist, a middle-aged man named Rowan, listened in silence as Elias scrolled through charts and diagrams. His eyes widened slightly when he saw the patterns. "You've got him," Rowan finally said. "Not just him, you've got an entire racket. But we'll need to verify independently." "I've already mirrored the documents," Elias replied quietly. "Encrypted, timestamped, uploaded." "He can't bury it." Rowan smiled faintly. "Then this is going to make waves." Within a week, the Chronicle published the first article. Landlord Empire built on fraud, data analyst uncovers network of housing exploitation. The story exploded. Local TV picked it up. Tenants from other buildings began contacting the cooperative office, sharing their own stories of broken heat, fake repairs, and eviction threats. Harold's name flooded social media. Each new report echoed the same corruption, deliberate neglect, hidden shell companies, and falsified records. City investigators reopened cases. Fines tripled. The state's attorney general announced an inquiry into property fraud. The machine Harold had spent decades building began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. But exposure came with danger. One night, as Elias returned home from a community meeting, he found his apartment door ajar. Inside, drawers had been ransacked. His computer was gone. Nothing else touched. No signs of forced entry. Whoever had done it knew exactly what to take and what to leave behind as a warning. He didn't call the police. He just sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where his laptop had been, the sound of the radiator hissing in the background. But he wasn't panicked. The data was safe duplicated, cloud stored, untouchable. What they had stolen was just a machine. By morning, Rowan's paper had already published the next expose. Harold Nix under federal investigation for tax fraud. Elias stood by the window, watching as light poured into the street. Down below, tenants were gathering outside for morning coffee, laughing, talking, alive. The building that once symbolized misery now felt like something sacred. Harold's last act of retaliation had failed. The world now saw what he truly was. The court dismissed his lawsuit within days, citing bad faith litigation. His other properties began defaulting under federal liens. The city revoked his management licenses. But Elias didn't celebrate. He was too tired. The war had been fought with keyboards and cold air, with patience instead of power. And yet, as spring approached, he began to feel something rare, peace. The repairs resumed. The cooperative started receiving grants again. They painted the hallways, replaced the wiring, even installed new security lights. The building hummed with warmth and laughter once more. Still, every night before bed, Elias opened one final file, a private note within Project Furnace. It contained no data, no calculations, no numbers. Just a single sentence he'd written months ago, in the darkest part of winter. If they try to freeze you out, learn how to build the fire yourself. Now, the fire burned bright, not just in his apartment, but in every room of 214 Ashbury Avenue. And yet, he knew the story wasn't quite over. Because when people like Harold fall, they don't vanish. They leave embers, and someone always tries to fan them back to life. Spring arrived slowly on Ashbury Avenue. The snow melted into gray puddles. The city's trees budded with shy leaves, and for the first time in years, the building's brick walls caught the warmth of sunlight instead of shadow. The air carried the scent of wet concrete and renewal. To anyone walking past, 214 Ashbury Avenue looked ordinary, just another aging complex in a forgotten neighborhood. But inside, something extraordinary was unfolding. Elias had shifted from strategist to builder. His spreadsheets no longer mapped legal battles or financial traps. They tracked progress, walls repaired, budgets balanced, schedules met. The columns glowed with numbers that finally meant life, not loss. Work crews filled the hallways now, electricians, plumbers, painters, and carpenters. The sound of drills and hammers replaced the silence that had once haunted the building. Tenants moved freely, laughing, sharing food, holding open doors for one another. The cooperative wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. Marjorie called it the quiet revolution. She came by often, clipboard in hand, inspecting progress. The cooperative had received new funding, a mix of grants, low-interest city loans, and community donations. The headline from the Chronicle had sparked something larger. A wave of small housing groups forming to buy and restore neglected buildings across the city. Ashbury Avenue had become the symbol of possibility, a proof that tenants could turn resistance into ownership. Elias, however, stayed behind the scenes. He declined interview requests, ignored social media tags, and refused every invitation to tell his story. The attention felt strange to him. His satisfaction came from simpler things. A hallway light that no longer flickered, a boiler that hummed evenly, a rent ledger that balanced to the cent. But even peace had a price. The building's finances were still fragile. Every repair drained the reserves, every delay added cost. The cooperative board met weekly to discuss priorities. Some wanted faster renovations, others pushed for long-term savings. Elias mediated quietly, balancing hope with realism. He knew how easily success could turn into overreach. One afternoon, as workers hauled out rusted pipes from the basement, Elias stood watching the debris, the literal guts of the building being carried into sunlight. The smell of damp metal filled the air. For years, these pipes had carried cold water through cold walls, neglected and ignored. Now they were being replaced with new steel, gleaming in the light. He realized that this was more than repair. It was transformation. The tenants began to reclaim the building's identity. They planted small flowers along the entrance. Someone painted a mural in the lobby, a rising sun over a row of brick homes with the words, "We stayed warm." Kids played in the courtyard again. Even the air smelled different, cleaner, less tired. But in the quiet corners of this renewal, Elias still felt the presence of what came before. Harold's shadow had faded, but it wasn't gone. The federal investigation had expanded beyond him, uncovering dozens of other landlords in similar schemes. Some of them had already gone bankrupt, others were fighting in court. Occasionally, Elias received emails from journalists asking for background details. He always sent the same reply: focus on the system, not the man. Late one evening, he sat in his office, a small converted storage room now lined with charts and city plans. Marjorie stopped by, setting 2 cups of coffee on the table. "The inspector signed off on the boiler replacement," she said, her voice carrying a mix of pride and exhaustion. "That's the last major repair." Elias nodded, running a hand over the updated report. "Then it's official. The building's code compliant." Marjorie smiled. "You did it." "No," Elias said quietly. "We did." Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood. Streetlights blinked on, their glow reflecting off the newly painted facade. The building no longer looked weary, it looked alive. Yet as Elias watched the soft light spreading through the windows, he couldn't help but think ahead. The cooperative was stable now, but sustainability required more than structure. It needed governance, transparency, and trust. The same data discipline that had defeated Harold would now have to preserve what they'd built. He opened a fresh file on his laptop, Ashbury Operations Framework. It wasn't too glamorous, just an organized blueprint for how the cooperative would function after the rebuilding phase. Transparent budgets, maintenance schedules, community votes, accountability logs. He wanted the system to outlive him. That night, he walked the hallways alone. The radiators whispered warmth through the pipes, steady and rhythmic. He passed the doors of families who had once lived in fear, now sleeping peacefully in safety they earned. He paused near the lobby mural, the painted sun glowing under the soft ceiling light. For a long time, he stood there, listening to the hum of a building reborn. The story could have ended there, the good tenant who became an unlikely landlord, who turned injustice into empowerment. But Elias knew better. The real story wasn't about one building. It was about the thousands like it, still trapped in silence, waiting for their own fire to be lit. And in the coming months, as requests began pouring in from other tenant groups seeking guidance, Elias found himself facing a new kind of challenge, not fighting for warmth, but spreading it. Because what began as survival had become something far greater, a blueprint for change. By the time summer rolled over the city, the story of Ashbury Avenue had become more than a headline. It had become a movement. News outlets still mention Elias occasionally, usually as a passing reference in stories about housing reform, but he no longer read the articles. The real work had moved beyond publicity. In May, the cooperative's small office, once Harold's old management room, now bright and filled with plants, began receiving calls from tenant groups across the state. A single mother from Brookline Street wanted advice on starting an escrow petition. A retired nurse from Harborview asked how to document housing code violations. Entire tenant associations began visiting Ashbury Avenue just to walk the halls, to see what a community-owned building looked like. Elias didn't call himself a leader, but people treated him like one. He still worked his day job as a data analyst remotely, but his nights belonged to the tenants, spreadsheets of budgets, inspection templates, simple management frameworks that could be replicated elsewhere. He began hosting weekend workshops, teaching ordinary renters how to use public databases, file violation reports, and track landlord patterns using the same forensic data methods that had taken Harold down. He called the initiative Warm City. It wasn't an organization at first, just a shared folder full of open-source tools, templates, and guides. But within months, it grew into a registered nonprofit supported by Marjorie's network. The mission was clear: empower tenants through data transparency and collective ownership. Ashbury Avenue became its headquarters. The building itself was thriving. Each apartment had been restored, the roof insulated, the foundation sealed. The once gloomy basement had been converted into a small community center with a children's playroom, a library corner, and a conference table made from salvaged doors. The mural in the lobby, "We Stayed Warm," now stood above a bronze plaque that read, "Owned by those who refuse to be silenced." But with growth came complexity. Managing one building had been difficult. Mentoring dozens of others was an entirely different challenge. Elias spent long hours reviewing legal documents, speaking with city councils, and negotiating with skeptical banks. Most institutions still viewed tenant cooperatives as risks: fragile, emotional, unsustainable. Elias countered with data, graphs, heat maps, statistical models proving lower eviction rates, higher maintenance compliance, and stronger community retention among tenant-owned properties. Gradually, the numbers began to shift minds. By late summer, Warm City had helped organize 7 new cooperatives across 3 boroughs. The motto worked: patient, disciplined, transparent. Each new cooperative fed its own data back into Elias's system, creating a living network of accountability. He had built not just a building, but an ecosystem. Still, he couldn't ignore the strain. The work consumed him. Emails poured in at all hours. Meetings ran late into the night. The peace he'd earned after Harold's downfall had been replaced by a new kind of pressure, the weight of expectation. Every success brought another call for help, another crisis to solve. One evening, as he sat alone in the community center, Elias looked over the newest data from Warm City's projects. Success rates were high, but so were the burnout reports from volunteers. He realized something crucial: revolution needed rest. If Warm City was going to last, it couldn't depend on one person's sleepless devotion. He began delegating. He formed a leadership board composed of representatives from each cooperative: teachers, nurses, janitors, young tech workers, retirees. They weren't activists by profession. They were tenants who understood struggle. Together, they created a system of shared governance, ensuring every decision was democratic and documented. It was no longer about Elias saving anyone. It was about everyone learning to save themselves. Meanwhile, Harold's trial continued in the background of city life, a slow bureaucratic grind of lawyers and audits. Occasionally, updates appeared in the news: assets frozen, properties sold to cover restitution. He had become a symbol of what the city wanted to forget: greed exposed. Elias never attended the hearings. He didn't need to. The outcome was inevitable. Instead, he poured his focus into expansion. Warm City began partnering with universities, training architecture students to assess low-income housing for structural risks. Local businesses donated supplies. Even the city government, once indifferent, started consulting the cooperative network for policy guidance. And yet, in moments of quiet, when the building was still and the night stretched long, Elias sometimes walked up to the roof. From there, he could see the sprawl of the city, the towers, the lights, the unending patchwork of roofs. He knew that beneath many of those roofs, tenants still lived as he once had, freezing, afraid, unheard. Ashbury Avenue was just one spark in a city full of cold rooms, but fire, he learned, spreads. One evening in late August, Marjorie joined him on the roof. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of rain. Below them, the city pulsed like a living organism. "You've changed things," she said quietly. Elias shook his head. "We changed one building. The rest still needs work. Marjorie smiled faintly. Every system starts with a single pattern. You built one that works. He didn't answer, but his eyes traced the horizon, the endless line of roofs stretching toward the dark. He could almost feel the stories beneath them. Tenants recording temperatures, photographing mold, organizing meetings in cold kitchens. They were gathering data, gathering courage. The same way he once did, the same way change always begins. Autumn arrived quietly, folding the city into amber light and early shadows. The leaves along Ashbury Avenue turned gold, and the air carried that crisp stillness before winter's return. The building at 214 Ashbury no longer looked like an artifact of hardship. Its windows glowed at night, filled with the soft pulse of normal lives, dinners, laughter, warmth. Inside, the community center buzzed almost daily. Flyers on the wall announced workshops, tenant escrow filing 101, budget transparency training, data mapping for housing rights. A small bulletin board tracked Warm City's reach, red pins for every cooperative established, yellow pins for those in progress. It was dotted across the map now, stretching beyond city limits, into towns Elias had never visited. The idea had evolved into something bigger than anyone expected. What began as one tenant's retaliation against injustice had become a citywide web of data, activism, and collective management. Warm City wasn't just helping tenants organize, it was standardizing justice. Each cooperative in the network followed the same system Elias had designed: public ledgers tracking rent and expenses, maintenance logs linked with time-stamped photographs, complaint records automatically submitted to city portals, governance dashboards that ensured every decision, from paint color to repair budgets, was transparent and voted upon. The software, an open-source application built by volunteer coders, was simple yet revolutionary. For decades, landlords had thrived on silence and confusion. Elias's network replaced both with data and light. But expansion brought visibility, and visibility brought attention, not all of it friendly. By late October, Elias began receiving subtle warnings, anonymous emails, deleted voicemails that left behind distorted static. City developers and property investors weren't pleased. Some accused Warm City of destabilizing the rental market. Others whispered that Elias was turning housing into digital socialism. He ignored it all at first. Progress always threatened power. But then, a familiar name resurfaced. Harold Nix, the ghost that refused to rest. He had resurfaced through a proxy, a private consortium lobbying to restrict access to property ownership grants. Hidden in the proposal, as fine print, was language that would quietly disqualify tenant-led cooperatives from receiving city loans, the very backbone of Warm City as model. It was legal sabotage. Elias discovered it while reviewing a routine funding request. The draft policy came across his desk through a sympathetic city clerk who had learned to trust him. When he saw the sponsor's name, Nick's Housing Recovery Group, his stomach tightened. It was Harold's last card, revenge through legislation. He called an emergency meeting. That evening, representatives from every cooperative in the network gathered via video conference, dozens of faces appearing on the screen, young and old, weary and hopeful. Elias explained the situation clearly, methodically. The room fell silent as they realized what was at stake. If the bill passed, their ability to grow by or maintain property collectively would vanish overnight. Marjorie spoke first. "We've come too far to let a loophole erase us," she said. The network mobilized. Within 48 hours, Warm City launched a coordinated data campaign, not protests, not slogans, but proof. Every cooperative submitted records of improved housing conditions, reduced evictions, and transparent finances. The data showed measurable community stability and savings for the city, the kind no legislator could ignore. The press picked it up. The Chronicle ran another headline: "Tenant-owned network outperforms private landlords in safety and efficiency." Talk shows debated it, economists analyzed it. The proposed bill, Harold's last weapon, collapsed under public scrutiny. Harold himself, once a figure of swaggering control, appeared briefly in a televised hearing. His voice was low, defiant, but the weight of exposure hung over him like smoke. The man who once shut off a tenant's heat to prove dominance was now reduced to defending business practices against a wall of documented facts. Elias didn't watch the whole broadcast. He didn't need to. He had already seen how this story ended. Instead, he turned back to the network dashboard. Worm City now spanned 19 cooperatives, each self-governed, each replicating the model. The platform ran smoothly. Clean data streams, automatic alerts, verified audits. Transparency had become a habit, not a burden. And yet, as he looked at the map, Elias realized something profound. He wasn't looking at dots of property anymore. He was looking at a pattern, a digital architecture of fairness spreading across the city. Every pin represented people who had refused fear, who had learned how to document, organize, and persist. Late one night, Elias walked the quiet halls of 214 Ashbury again. The walls no longer bore cracks. They carried echoes, children laughing behind closed doors, the hum of steady heating pipes, the rhythm of normalcy restored. He reached the top floor and looked out at the streetlights below, glowing softly in the mist. For years, landlords like Harold had hidden behind paper barriers and silence. But now, tenants had something far stronger: connection. The network wasn't made of wires and code. It was made of memory, proof, and trust. Elias smiled faintly. The war that began with cold air and silence had become something eternal. Warmth wasn't just in the building anymore. It was in the system. And as winter's edge began to creep back into the air, Elias felt no fear this time. He knew what to do when the cold came. He simply had to share the fire. Winter returned to the city once more, quieter this time, gentler somehow. The streets of Ashbury Avenue shimmered under the soft glow of streetlights reflected in the snow. Frost gathered along window panes, but inside 214 Ashbury, the radiators hummed steadily, filling every room with warmth. No one in the building worried about heat anymore. It came automatically, like trust rebuilt after a long winter. For Elias, that hum was the sound of closure and continuity. 3 years had passed since the night he sat in that same apartment, wrapped in blankets, fighting the cold of neglect. Now he stood by the same window, looking out across a skyline that felt different. Not because the city had changed, but because people had learned to change it themselves. Worm City had become a fixture of that transformation. What began as a network of tenants had evolved into a full-fledged civic movement. It operated across state lines now, coordinating hundreds of cooperatives, managing thousands of units. The open-source system Elias had once built on his kitchen table had been adopted by municipal housing boards, taught in universities, and translated into multiple languages. The Ashbury model, as the papers called it, was no longer just a story, it was policy. Government officials visited 214 Ashbury regularly to study its systems. Journalists called it the building that changed tenant law. College students wrote theses about it. Even developers, once hostile, began experimenting with cooperative structures to rebuild trust in communities they'd long exploited. Elias, though, had grown quieter through it all. Fame had never interested him. His satisfaction came from seeing ordinary people doing extraordinary things, parents leading maintenance meetings, retired teachers chairing boards, single tenants learning to read financial statements with the same confidence they once reserved for survival. The movement no longer needed him in the same way. And that, he thought, was exactly how it should be. One cold morning, he met Marjorie in the community center. The place smelled of coffee and new paint. Children's drawings covered the bulletin board, pictures of buildings with smiling windows and suns too big for the sky. "You've done more than anyone could have imagined," Marjorie said, setting a folder on the table. "The city's naming you as one of its civic fellows this year." Elias smiled faintly. "That's kind. But I think the building deserves it more than I do," She laughed softly. You can't give an award to concrete. He shook his head. It's not concrete anymore. It's a story. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of laughter echoing from upstairs. The building felt alive, like it had a pulse. Later that evening, Elias returned to his apartment, still small, still modest, still the same unit where everything began. He opened his laptop, now much older, its surface worn smooth by years of typing. He scrolled through the warm city dashboard. The map had expanded far beyond anything he had imagined. Hundreds of red pins, each representing a place where tenants had turned struggle into ownership. But it wasn't just the scale that struck him, it was the detail. Each dot linked to a name, a set of faces, a record of decisions made democratically, transparently, proudly. The network had grown beyond his control, and for the first time that thought filled him with peace. Control, he realized, had always been Harold's obsession. Freedom, not control, was the true measure of success. He closed the laptop and stood by the window. Snow was falling again, the street below glowing gold in the lamplight. A group of children played outside, throwing snowballs, their laughter ringing through the cold. Somewhere out there, in another city, in another crumbling building, someone was discovering the same truth Elias once had, that power begins not with wealth or violence, but with documentation, with proof, with unity. He thought of the first night the heat had gone off, of the way his breath had turned to mist in the air. He thought of the endless hours compiling data, the fear, the exhaustion, the isolation, and how all of it had been transformed into something living, something shared. Warm City wasn't just a system. It was proof that ordinary people, armed with persistence and truth, could rewrite the structure of ownership itself. Before bed, Elias wrote one final note, a message he intended to leave for whoever would manage the cooperative after him. It wasn't a speech or a warning, just a few quiet words typed into a document titled Legacy. Keep everything transparent. Keep everything human. Never let silence return. He saved the file, closed the laptop, and turned off the light. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft, steady, endless. Inside, the heat stayed on. The pipes sang gently through the walls, the same rhythm that had once defined both despair and defiance. Now, it was the rhythm of survival turned into structure. As dawn crept over the city, the sun glinted off hundreds of rooftops, some broken, some still in shadow, some newly repaired through the hands of those who refused to be frozen again. And among them all, one stood quietly, glowing with warmth from every window, 214 Ashbury Avenue, the building that proved that justice, once ignited, could outlast even the longest winter.